Right. Intellectual property is extremely important for companies in alternative proteins, especially considering the rapidly growing and competitive nature of the market. Reasons range from maintaining a competitive edge, securing investment, licensing and partnerships, building brand recognition, and so on. So, to delve into the topic a little bit more closely, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sara Holland, partner, and Andrew Tyndall, senior associate, both from Clarkson, and both of whom advise and represent clients in synthetic biology, alternative proteins, and that also includes cultivated meat. So, Sara, Andrew, welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, brilliant. Had to have you here. How active is your company in the field of food tech? I mean, how long has Clarkson been working with companies in novel foods?
We've been working a very long time with long-standing food tech practice. So we particularly including fermentation technology. So we have a big presence in the Nordics. Well, obviously that's a big center, but we cover the whole gamut from cultivated meat and plant-based sort of dairy fermentation technologies all the way through to bioreactors, media enabling technologies, that kind of stuff. Personally, I've been involved with cultivated meat from quite early on. I've sort of represented clients from very early days when they were startups licensing in technology through to them being quite successful large concerns, as well as working with specialist VCs in that area as well. So we've sort of personally, I've been here for the sort of the journey from it being a niche area that people hadn't heard of to, well, now where are we? $1 billion valuations for some companies. So it's been an interesting journey.
Mm-hmm. In the field of IP, is it a completely different discipline, or can you cross over from other sectors, or do you have to have have a specialism in this particular area?
I think for me, I guess a lot of what I'm seeing now is very much more very biotech focused. So I suppose historically, a lot of kind of the alternative proteins that I'm aware of would have been maybe handled more by maybe chemistry type attorneys who've got the kind of processy kind of formulation background. But a lot of what I'm seeing and what I'm quite excited about, and the kind of stuff me and Andrew work on, it's getting more hardcore biotech, which is the stuff I really enjoy. So it's all the precision fermentation, it's messing around with genes, culturing cells. So I think you do need to have that kind of biological understanding for a lot of the new stuff versus, it's just a protein, and it's that's more the biochemistry side of how it may react in a formulation, I suppose.
Yeah, and I agree. I think as well that we're seeing that on the sort of the innovator side and the investor side as well. So sort of historically, this has been a food tech concern, right? It's been, you think of corn, that kind of technology is very much in the traditional food science camp. But now, alternative proteins, it's more, the investors are much more like biotech investors. They're much more like tech investors, and the companies are much more like those. Like those kinds of concerns too, but of course they're still working in a commodity field where it's food at the end of the day, right? It's not like pharmaceuticals. You don't sell them for tens of thousands of pounds per unit. So I think one thing that I found is as the field's matured, clients, investors, and therefore their attorneys all having to become a bit more aware of those two worlds. Like it's straddling high tech and then commodity production, and that's an interesting space.
Given the length of time that you've been working in this field, what have been your personal observations of how alternative proteins have evolved over the past 5-10 years?
I think for me, like it's like I just said, it's getting very much more biotechy focused. So maybe historically, a lot of the alternative proteins were more the plant-based proteins that you just take and you do stuff with. And now we're creating new proteins, engineering yeast or whatever to make alternative proteins for us. There's obviously also the kind of less biotechy, but also interesting where people are like, the black soldier fly kind of side of alternative proteins. People are doing that a lot more. So hopefully it's all going to come down to public acceptance, I think, of a lot of these things, or how much the public knows. Andrew, you probably know more than me, but I'm sure one of the conferences I went to where in France, I may be wrong, I hope this is not wrong. In France, quite a lot of the kind of protein that's maybe in things like pasta comes from flies. But it's just in there in the ingredients. So there are a lot of countries adopting all these kind of different things. But yeah, my personal observations is it's more biotechy. There's a strong kind of green focus. It's all promoted as being more sustainable. I think a lot of companies still need to do the proper life cycle assessment, but then that's a whole other issue of how do you standardize life cycle assessment so people know what they're talking about. So the alternative protein itself, and then that's kind of spawning separate industries around, like Andrew mentioned, people making new bioreactors. So a lot of my clients are very much making bioreactors for people who are making alternative proteins, or people who are doing the ancillary kind of things to cultured meat. So if you culture some meat cells, probably doesn't taste great on its own. So people are working on kind of the cultured fats and the other things that would go with that. So they're not making the protein part themselves, but they're making the other stuff using biotech. And there's also a big movement to, you've got the innovators making the new products, then you've got other companies who are kind of helping them scale up. So CDMOs who are kind of, one of the companies in Bristol kind of really scaling up the cultured meat for other companies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Did you have anything to add there, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, you asked about 10 years, right? Just over 10 years ago, because what was it, 2013? We had the world's first cultivated meat burger was sort of eaten actually about 5 miles from sitting in London. And that was, a big event, but a proof of concept, and it cost $300,000 or whatever it was to produce. And now, within that 10 years, if you've got a couple of $100 to spare and can get on the waiting list, you can have your choice of tasting menus for cultivated meat. And we crack some of the big problems as well. So things that commentators over those sort of 5-10 years have been saying were the big barriers, like finding replacements for bovine-derived serums and additives for cultivation. The replacements have been found for those, and there's multiple competing ways of doing that. We've had sort of specialist VCs putting targeted investment in those areas. So I think, I've heard about the death of plant-based and the death of cultivated meat more times than I care to count in the sort of 5 years I've been working in it. I think now we're at sort of a bit of a crossroads moment. I think Sarah touched on the scaling up. We've got this ecosystem around, which hopefully is going to help crack that. I think scale remains, in my view, sort of an existential threat for all of these technologies. That's true for I talk a lot about cultivated meat because that's something I've done a lot of work in, but the same is true for precision fermentation, for sort of more advanced next generation plant-based as well. I think if you can't scale it, then it doesn't matter how environmentally friendly, how ethical or delicious it is, right? It doesn't really matter whether people will accept it as well if you can't produce enough of the product to make that open question. So I think that's going to be the real crunch point over the next 10 years is whether how that problem is solved. I think we're going to probably see a lot of consolidation as well around that because it will become, it's now a very fragmented field. I think we're going to have a few big producers so that as people move together, as they track that problem, but there'll be an ecosystem of sort of ancillary industries, so processing, bioreactors, additives, enabling technologies, so to speak. I think there's going to be a real blooming there. So it's going to be at a crossroads, and it's going to be very different. I think if you ask us again in 10 years, what's happened.
It's interesting you say that. Actually, we have an investment feature in this same edition, and the 10 thought leaders in this sort of VC community, they've all noticed this trend towards the companies in the value chain rather than the companies producing the end products. So it's interesting you say that. So I mean, what are some of the IP complexities to consider if you're a startup involved in alternative proteins? We've probably got an hour and 2 for that.
For me, I think the complexities for a startup in this space are probably similar to a startup anywhere. You've probably not got much money. You need to protect what you can protect, primarily for your own business purposes. You don't, the whole point of protecting your IP is to stop people copying you, if we're talking about patents anyway. So you want to protect it for that reason, but you also need to protect it to secure investment. So investors, there's a lot to be said for trade secrets, and a lot of companies will, and every company should make a decision whether they're going to protect something with a patent or keep it as a trade secret. Investors seem to very much prefer people to at least have a patent. So a lot of the companies I took on the last few years are getting to the stage now where VCs are saying, where's your patent? It's like, well, sometimes it's too early because they're an early stage startup. They can't file a patent, but they have got all these trade secrets. So I think it's a challenge to kind of present what you have got and what you will get to investors in a way that investors are happy with. So some investors do a lot of IP due diligence, and we work with some investors to do that. A lot of investors don't do any, and they will just look at whatever the pitch deck is and say, well, where's your IP? And if the startup can't give a valid reason as to why they haven't got any patents or anything, then I think that's where a lot of them fall down. But I think in terms of like alternative protein space, there's a lot of things that you can protect with patents. It's not like it's a weird space where there's unpatentable subject matter. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Andrew, on that one.
Yeah, just that I think realistic scope is a really big challenge for startups in this sector. So I used to do a lot of diligence in this area, looking at early stage startups, and the days of being able to get patent protection that fundamentally covers the big picture idea of whether that's growing chicken cells in a bioreactor and making meat. Obviously, we know that's sort of out there, but there was a long time where that was the what people were trying to get a patent on, despite the fact that actually they hadn't been able to achieve it, and also that it's kind of known. But the same is true in precision fermentation. The same is true in plant-based. It's finding those realistic scopes, which might be quite narrow, and that requires a real understanding of the landscape of the sector, but also of the technology of the startup. And it's hard when you're a startup because you want to tell the big story. You want to say, we're going to do this big thing. It's going to be amazing. To then sort of have to sit down and think about your IPs actually, if the story you tell is here, when you're trying to win investment, that actually what you're protecting is maybe a much smaller part of that. But and it takes quite a lot of effort to identify that. But that's, I think, where it lives and dies in terms of the value proposition.
This is probably a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You have the process of cultivating meat. Why is no one company allowed to patent that particular process? How are numerous companies able to do the same thing, or they've got slightly different nuances in how they do it?
I mean, the fundamental reason is because the earliest patents in that area are now over 20 years old. It's quite old technology in some ways. Very, very early filings before it was really reduced to practice beyond proof of concept out there with. So that's like whether that's Forgax or Vale and their teams. Now it is about nuances, right? It's about the specific way. Essentially, cells grow in culture. We know this. It's been done in medical research for decades. The challenge for cultured meat is making it so that you have cells that are able to keep dividing. So they don't. Normally, cells don't want to keep dividing. At some point, they stop because otherwise, a cell that keeps dividing is as a tumor, essentially. And then making sure they do that quickly enough to be useful. And producing something that's structured enough to not just be basically a slime of cells, so it's got some kind of useful end result. And the way you solve those three problems can be very different. So whether that's you're using, you're changing the conditions you keep the cells in order to make sure that they divide more quickly, or maybe you're selecting particular cells or editing them in some way. All these approaches are used by different companies, and they all have their different way of cracking that problem of turning the idea that's known that you can grow cells in culture into actually getting something that you want to eat and in a quantity that you can eat it out the end.
Sarah, did you have anything to add to that?
No, that's right. So there will be lots of patents to lots of different methods of culturing meat. Like Andrew said, the kind of historic ones are all old, so that kind of general concept's gone.
Mm-hmm. I think it might have been Willem van Eelen who probably filed the first patent for cell culturing meat. I think that might have been in the 90s. I'm not too sure. I might be corrected.
They are really old. Some of them are very, very old, right? So I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but while prosecuting cultured meat patents, right, where the patent office will identify early prior art, I've had citations of speeches by Winston Churchill where he speculated that one day in the future it'll be possible, and it's sort of the idea that this could be a thing that's done. Is very, very old. And it's now reducing to practice, and it has been for 30 years.
On the face of it, the alternative proteins sector is it's quite small compared to the whole foods market. So there's on the outside, there seems to be a collaborative approach, lots of support for each other, these companies, but it's constantly evolving. So what's the ideal strategic IP approach to keep pace with the competition? It is a competitive environment after all.
I think for me, there is no ideal, and it's all going to be very dependent on your business in your own business context. So if you're going to be licensing out your product to a lot of people, trade secrets are probably not ideal because you're making it kind of semi-public at least, and people can reverse engineer what you're doing. If you're keeping everything in-house, again, you might want to then think about trade secrets. If you're kind of, I was just talking about the methods of culturing meat. A lot of those methods people will not patent because the patent scope you're going to get is quite narrow. You're telling the world exactly how you do it. And so that in those kind of instances, you're better off keeping it as a trade secret. So, yeah, I don't think there's an ideal approach. You want to protect with patents what you need to protect, and then keep back with trade secrets what you don't need, what the world doesn't need to know, I guess. Andrew, you've probably got something to add on that.
Yeah, I think, I totally agree. I think trade secrets, as the field matures, will become more important. These are secret recipes, right? The 11 herbs and spices, the Coca-Cola secret recipe. The problem with the patent is you have to tell people how you do it. So, and once your patent terms expired, it's there for the taking. So that's why, that balance is there. That's important. But to sort of build on what Sarah was saying about the business context, I think the ideal strategic approach begins with really identifying your niche. Like, what are you actually doing? What makes you different? What's your approach? How is it distinctive? We are now at the stage where, being the chicken guys, the cultivated chicken guys isn't a distinctive niche. Being geographically, we are the people who are doing this in Europe or in Israel, or we're the West Coast or the East Coast US people. Like, there's already that kind of that's already taken. It's identifying, like, okay, well, what are we actually bringing? What makes us different, and then building the IP strategy around protecting that. It's the thing I was saying earlier about the idea of identifying realistic scope, but it's also thinking, okay, well, we are solving the problem in this way, and that's what we need to focus our IP on protecting. And maybe the other stuff around it we can be more collaborative with, or we can share, or we don't have to worry so much about whether or not that's locked down, because that's not really what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I think Andrew and I have both fallen into the trap of, because we're patent attorneys, we're focusing on the kind of clever technical aspects of stuff, but we're totally forgetting about the IP angle in terms of trademarks. So a lot of the companies I work with in the industrial biotech space, they probably don't really care about trademarks. They're not consumer facing, whereas obviously a lot of the companies we're talking about here, they need to have strong brands. So although Andrew is saying you need to kind of have your own unique thing, you can have two companies doing exactly the same thing, but if one's got the much stronger brand and recognition with consumers, they're going to do much better. So I think this is one area where, contrary to a lot of my other clients, you really need that strong brand protection and trademarks. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there because I think I tend to forget trademarks quite often. Yeah. Sorry, trademark attorneys at our firm.
Now, it's quite challenging if you're a company in this field, because let's say you started the process of developing your method for cultivating meat, or for developing a plant-based product 4 or 5 years ago. Over time, that process may have been refined and tuned, and you actually may change your original patent in some ways in the process of improving your product. Is that right? Is that fair to say, or something you have to keep an eye on all the time?
Yeah. You can't change your patent. I'm just going to jump in. You can't go back and change your patent. What you will do is file new patents. So you kind of always keep on top of this pipeline. So patents have got a 20-year term. If you only ever had one patent, your protection will only last 20 years, which might be enough because you might go out of business by then, I guess. But ideally, you keep on top of filing new stuff. So your kind of protection around, you might have your product, your process, the bioreactor that you develop, the kind of additives, all kind of extends that longevity of protection of your product. Mm-hmm. Got Andrew, you've probably got.
Yeah, no, exactly, and it's one of those. It's a Red Queen situation, right? If you're constantly running forwards, you're constantly developing new technology and improvements and providing more protection. So your foundational IP, for going concerns, it expires, but you're refining your products, refining your methods, as you say, and gaining that new protection. So you maintain that commercial edge, as well as, of course, the infrastructure, or the goodwill, the brand recognition that you build up in that time. Lots of large companies that we think of today in all kinds of sectors, their first big idea, I mean, it's more than 20 years ago, their patents have definitely expired, even in patent-heavy industries. And it's not just that they've decided to make something completely new. They're probably making the same products, but they're doing it in more efficient ways that that are more cost effective, because they've found a new way of doing it that's better, and that will be protected. This is very much a sort of more, this is very common in the sort of biotech and pharmaceutical worlds, and I think that was that intersection in novel protein production, in that it's sort of, whilst it is food, and from a branding perspective and trademark perspective, it's going to be treated like a traditional food industry in lots of ways. And it has to deal with commodity problems that, commodity scale problems that food industries have to deal with. The actual technology and science and development is much more like pharma and biotech. So the IP strategies kind of have to play both those sides off. You have to be able to, and the way you do that is sort of to do both, which of course is really challenging and requires a degree of sophistication that, is a lot to do when you're a startup trying to attract investors, trying to actually develop the technology, build your brand.
Do you get a sense that startups in this sector are pretty tuned into IP? Is it something that they get off the bat, or is it something that, are you finding companies completely forgetting about it?
So I spend probably, I wouldn't even want to think what percentage of my time I spend kind of trying to, and Andrew, writing IP educational pieces, talking, especially because a lot of this synthetic biology stuff is still coming out of university, so I do a lot of educational talks to like academics and students and postdocs, new startups, chatting to them and kind of just telling them like the basics, because they just don't know. And there's, my background is I was a postdoc until I was about 33, so very much in biotech research, didn't know anything about IP. As soon as I left and started this job, within the first few months, there was so much I wish I'd known as a scientist. That would have, I don't know if it would change what I'd have done in the lab, but for a startup, there's kind of very key essential things you need to know. So yeah, we do what we can to kind of help. There are some that do know a lot of stuff. There's a lot of incubators and accelerators. Every time I like open LinkedIn, there's a new one I've not come across before. So there's a lot of kind of help out there, and we, like me and Andrew, mentor and lecture on quite a lot of those. So yeah, I think there's a lot of help out there, and it's probably better than it was. But yeah, if you've got other experiences, Andrew.
No, I agree. I think there is definitely some knowledge here. I think people realise that this is less so in plant-based, I'd say, because plant-based, it's a bit more, it's more like traditional food in lots of ways, right? Because it is, right? We have had textured soy proteins and similar things for a very long time, so it's more about recipe formulation. But a lot of companies do have an awareness of IP. I think sometimes it's a case of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. Because, as we were saying, it's a sophisticated, this is a sophisticated field, and it's a sophisticated strategy. It's very different in different countries in terms of how you want to think about what you want to protect and how you go about doing it. Sarah and I, it's our career. We spend all our time on it. And I think we're quite good at what we do, but we work very hard to acquire that knowledge. And I couldn't run these companies, run these startups, right? That's a whole different skill set that I don't have. So, of course, I don't expect startups to have attorney level knowledge awareness. I think the most useful thing that they need to know is that IP is important, and to know that they should probably call specialist advice to get that input and find the right advisors that they can work with, who understand their business, who understand the scaling issues that they're having as a startup going up to kind of and the exits they've got in mind, because a lot of these companies are not going to be thinking about acquisition. They're thinking about, which is very different to a lot of biotech, where you are ultimately hoping to be acquired by a large pharma company. It's very different in this field. So finding the right advice is just as important, I think, as finding advice full stop.
Yeah. I think if we're like busy startup founders, you should be able to find somebody who you can not hand over entirely, but essentially trust your advisors are going to do everything for you, really, because you've got enough stuff to do. And I think just to add on about what Andrew said about a little bit of knowledge being dangerous, like the worst thing that kind of makes me feel so sad is when you've got a client that you really, really like, and then they say, oh, I've had a go at drafting the patent for you. It's like, no, because I know it's going to be bad, and you're really nice, and I've got to kind of spend ages unpicking it without like upsetting you. So yeah, sometimes it's just best to let like your kind of IP advisors get on with it. It was the input that we asked for, but yeah.
I guess it's the same with regulatory guidance as well.
Oh, 100%.
Submitting your dossiers, it's just best to sort of hand it over to the experts.
Yeah, I've been asked about opinions on regulatory things, and my answer has been, I would put you in touch with someone, because I guarantee, I don't understand how it works, and if I try and busk it, I'm going to cause way more trouble than I'm going to solve. So you speak to my friend; they know all about it.
Before we come on to some of the broader implications, we're going to focus on just some last specific challenges. With plant-based proteins often mimicking the taste and texture of animal products, how can IP law distinguish between innovative creation and mere imitation?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a really interesting question, because it highlights a really big challenge IP-wise, which is that the holy grail in novel protein production is making a product that's going to be indistinguishable from a more traditional product, whether that's a cultivated meat or a plant-based or a precision fermentation, right? You want it to be the same. That's what we're in it for. But then that's very hard to protect, because patenting is all about those distinctions. As a rule, in most countries, you can't gain patent protection for a new product solely based on the fact that it's made through a new process. There are some exceptions. So Israel is a notable exception that's particularly relevant for alternative proteins. Finding you're in this difficult situation where it's kind of the better job you do, the harder it is to gain some IP protection for the product as such, and also the harder it is to enforce, because you can't. If it's completely indistinguishable, how would you know whether somebody had infringed your IP or whether they'd just produced a traditional meat or milk product? So that it is challenging, and it's going to become, I think, increasingly challenging. It's not enough to rely on terminology that we probably use day to day, like slaughter-free or cell-based, because these are fairly, the patent offices usually think they're quite unclear and non-technical terms. And I think the answer really is, and particularly as the tech becomes more sophisticated, that IP protection is going to be necessarily narrower, and it's going to focus more on processes of production than on the products themselves. So it's going to be about, and precursors as well. So it will be about, the value is going to be in protecting cell lines that are used to produce, whether it's to produce your cultured meat product, or whether it's to run your fermentation or produce your leg hemoglobins. And the processes for doing that at a scale and a profitable way, and a reliable, safety, doing it in a way that is food grade. And that's quite tricky, because process patents are often viewed as being, I think wrongly, is viewed as less valuable or less enforceable. But having these various overlapping rights to have maybe the narrow protection is sort of the way. We find distinction on smaller levels and we protect it, and then by having lots of overlapping rights together, you have the large scope is what you want to establish your market position.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree,
I think
Sarah?
just to add to what Andrew was saying, I think although companies are trying to make identical things, I guess for regulatory purposes, so it's kind of easier to get through. I think for me, the real promise of synthetic biology is to make better and improved things. So we could make functional proteins. Why make a protein that's the same as something else when you could make one that's more easy to digest or has got a better amino acid profile for a certain organism? They're the kind of exciting things for me, I think, about synthetic biology, where I hope people are going to start going to. You just need the regulatory system to catch up, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Sarah, as companies developed GMOs or genetically modified organisms for alternative proteins, are there any unique IP challenges associated with patenting living things?
So I think one of the challenges is that there is a lot of US focused advice out there. So in the US, you cannot protect natural things. So if I find a yeast that's really good at making, I don't know, for some reason you want to use it to eat, I could not protect that because it's a natural yeast. Whereas if I had engineered it, I can protect that. Whereas in many other countries, including Europe, you can protect naturally occurring things. So one of my clients, when I took them on, I had a call with them, and they were using a natural strain for whatever it is they're doing, and they thought they couldn't have a freedom to operate issue because you can't protect natural strains. I'm like, well, actually you can. So there could be patent rights out there to the strain that you're using because you just can't do it in Europe. So I think in the US. So I think one of the challenges is making sure you're kind of thinking globally about your IP, and although kind of different territories allow or don't allow certain things, making sure you're aware of that. But yeah, you can certainly protect engineered proteins, engineered strains, natural strains, natural proteins, nucleic acids. So in terms of the actual GMOs themselves, you can get patent protection to those, and if you can get that, it's quite strong protection. How you protect a GMO, I suppose if we're talking about GMO and it's been modified, hopefully you know what that modification is, and we will protect it by reference to that modification. So it would be a yeast expressing this protein or a yeast with this mutation, you would protect it like that. If it was more on the natural side, or you've evolved it and you don't know why it's good, you have to deposit it one of the international depositories under what's called the Budapest Treaty. So this is I won't go into detail. This is to kind of satisfy the sufficiency requirement of a patent. In a patent, we need to put somebody in the position to repeat the experiment, the technology. So if I've got a natural yeast, I can't describe that in words. I have to deposit it. Whereas if I've engineered it, I can describe how we've engineered it in words. So there's some of the key things I think to think about if we're especially talking about like more the precision fermentation side, and probably the cell lines for cultured meat as well. You can deposit those.
I think that was the specific topic of the IP column in our latest issue, actually, the depositing of organisms. Now, Andrew, this one's probably for you. How will IP rights be applied to novel cell-cultured meat products, considering the biological source materials involved?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of ways to do this, and savvy innovators will be pursuing all of them. There can be patents on the cell lines as such, and on the source cell lines. So whether that is through modifications. So, broadly speaking, there are two approaches for developing sufficient cell lines that work well enough to be using cultured meat products. And they are, in fact, actually the two big players in the field are using alternative approaches. You either edit cell lines, so through genetic modification or gene editing, which in lots of countries is treated as regulated as if it were not a GMO, which is particularly appealing, particularly in places like Europe where GMOs there's a lot of hostility to it. But that's one way of doing things. And another way is through sort of selecting particularly effective cell lines, maybe through through sort of repeated cycles of testing and picking the best ones and testing them and picking the best ones. But the cell lines as such, protecting those can be really valuable. These are fundamentally very useful as starting materials, and their progeny, which if they can be protected too, are going to be present in final products. Obviously, there'll be protection also can be focused on sort of the methods that you use for engineering those cell lines, so ways of making better cell lines as a process, or processes of using the cell lines to make the cultured meat. If there's something clever in there, maybe particular additives, that kind of thing, particular steps of incubating for this long, we find that it works really well. So, that's worth protecting. But also, I think a big area is going to be in sort of more the more ancillary areas, so things such as scaffolding. Some companies obviously are exploring this, some are less. So whether that's a gelatin scaffold, a plant-based scaffold for the cells to grow on, because essentially cells don't like growing. An individual cell being incubated to grow into a tissue often doesn't work very well. So you need to do something, basically give it a scaffold to grow on, for support, to allow oxygen flow, nutrient flow, that kind of thing as it's growing. And those scaffolds and methods of manufacturing are going to be really valuable bits of IP, because without them, it won't work. So, if you can gain protection there, you've got really real strong competitive advantage. And then sort of more downstream, it's the processes and sundries that are going to be used on cell culture meat products to gain protection. So things like media and additives, but then down the other end of the value chain, things like bioreactors, extruders, processing steps for texturing. You've got your cells, you're going to process them in layers. There's lots of patents that have been filed on that kind of process of the ways that you layer things in order to give the right textures that feel like from sort of that whole muscle cuts, for example. So all of these steps, so that's from the cell line you put in the reactor to the reactor itself, what you mix it with, and then all the things that happen to it, all can be sources of differentiation from other companies, and therefore can be protected, can be very valuably protected. For lots of companies, it'll be identifying which ones they want to pursue and which ones they want to keep as secrets and which ones they feel they could protect, but they don't think are particularly valuable. They do it this way, but they could do it another way, and they don't really mind. It doesn't really matter. So, there could be, when these things hit the shelves, there'll be dozens of IP rights, of patent rights, of trade secret rights, which have their own protection, and trademarks, of course, and the branding, although they're obviously more visible. But there will be dozens of hard IP rights protecting the product as you see it. It's not going to be the case of, it's not like with sort of how we think of maybe pharmaceuticals, where there is one patent for the drug, the chemical structure. It will be all those different steps that will go there. And for an innovator, what's useful there is it means you've got that flexibility when you are, for securing your position. If you do think there is an infringer, you can identify exactly which one of your suite of rights you think is going to be the most effective at capturing that infringement, and then you can to either stop them entering the market, stop them copying you, or whether that's as leverage in a negotiation. You might want to say, let's work together in the future, but you're clearly copying us, so we can work together, but it's going to be favorable to us. So having those repertoires is going to be really valuable to allow companies to scale and become profitable.
Yeah. Just picking up on some of what Andrew said there, like all the different components that go into a final product. I think what I'm seeing in the biotech community in general, really, the startup community, they're very collaborative. Everybody's working together. Like I might be the expert in the cell part, but Andrew might be the expert in the scaffolding. So I'm going to work with him. So although there may be multiple IP rights in that product, they might not all be mine. I might have in-licensed Andrew's rights to the scaffold, somebody else's rights to the fats. And I think this is the way, nobody's an expert in everything. I think this is the way that these companies can kind of scale faster by working with a lot of people. It is what I'm seeing quite a lot in the companies I work with.
Mm-hmm. I probably know what both of you are going to say to this next question, but could strong IP rights for alternative proteins stifle competition and hinder the overall technology's potential to address all of the concerns that they're supposed to address, environment, animal welfare, etc.?
I think for me,
silence.
When COVID hit, I had this kind of little crisis of like, oh God, are patents bad? Is there a different way? And I spent a long time looking at all the different, as far as I could, using Google, looking at different ways that the people have proposed to kind of an alternative to the patent system. So competitions, blah, 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 blah. I think ultimately I just came down to, it is really all about money. Although we all want to save the planet saving things have got to make money for somebody at the minute anyway, unless somebody comes up with an alternative to that. To make money, you need to have your space to recoup the costs. Therefore, you need the IP. And I can't see an alternative way around it. So for me, so similar to like the pharma side of things, maybe you will have monopolies, but if you didn't have the patent rights, you wouldn't have that product in the first place. So yes, you might have this like life-saving drug that costs a lot of money, which may or may not be fair, but without the patent rights in the first place, you wouldn't have the drug. So there wouldn't be that option. I turn it over a lot in my head and I can't come up with a different solution. So if anybody has one, I'm happy to hear it.
Do you have one, Andrew?
No, I think yeah, I totally agree with what Sarah was saying. I think it's fundamentally, I view IP as a tool, right? It is, you can have a patent, and once you have one, you can do anything you like with it. You can leave it sitting on a shelf. You can go and make completely unjustified threats to people. You should not do this. This is not, this is not legal advice, but the advice is do not make unjustified threats to people for no reason. But yeah, there's something inherent in these tools that means that necessarily they're going to stifle competition or prevent the realization of these goals. I think it's also worth remembering that this is a industry where there's a lot of capital expenditure needs to be put into to develop the technology and also to scale, right? There are, in many ways, large food technology. It is already a natural monopoly in some ways, and that you have to put, even if I wanted to, I could not go out tomorrow and start a competitive, a company that compete with Cargill or similar for producing conventional meats, because it's a huge amount of money is required to scale up, and that provides those kind of advantages. So for me, I view sort of IP in its role in this system of there's some real concerns about the environment, about affordability for customers, about access, but to solve them requires a lot of money, a lot of research, and a lot of hard capital expenditure on bioreactors and scaling up. It will be billions of dollars, and people don't give. If there's someone out there who wants to put billions of dollars into it to increase, then fine, that's up to them. But in reality, no one is out there pumping billions of dollars into solving these problems in a way that isn't linked to an investment, right? So what the IP rights do is provide that reassurance. So it allows people to attract investments, so it allows the money to come. And without it, there's not really a value proposition. And the money goes elsewhere. It goes into other things where there is a value proposition. And lots of those things may be maybe more environmentally damaging, or maybe just completely unrelated. Maybe people are going to invest in software companies or whatever else it is. So by having the strong IP rights, it creates that moat around your value proposition that lets investors know that they will be able to recoup on the investment. So you can attract the money to do the capital expenditure, to do the research, to actually bring the products to fruition. And then after 20 years, the patents expire and other people can do the same things you're doing. And moreover, in the meantime, you've published it. People can read it and go, oh, okay, well, I reckon I can improve it in this way, or the way they're doing that, they're using FBS, and that's it'd be good if we could solve that problem. So they didn't have to do it that way; they could use a different approach. So I think in terms of it promotes competition as much as hypothetical hindering.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think a lot of the companies I'm working with at the minute, especially the early stage ones who are wanting to start in an area, nobody wants to knowingly infringe somebody's patents. So they are trying to work with us kind of, where are the white spaces? Where are the bits where are there no patents? Or we're aware of this patent. What's the scope of it? What can we do to kind of innovate around it so we're not infringing it? So it kind of forces innovation as well. So, I think there's the two sides to it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of opportunity as well, of course. People do license things, right? IP isn't, we sometimes think of IP rights as being used to shut people down, but actually, in a lot of cases, that's not how it works at all. I think a really great example is gene editing, which is used in a lot of alternative protein technologies as a fundamental way of making the cells do something they don't do in nature. There are lots of patents on gene editing techniques through CRISPR-Cas9 system. But there are patent pools, which is basically you can go to the patent pool and you can pay a fee to use their technology. And you pay a license royalty in the same way you might license a song to use it in a film or similar. And the companies that made those tools have decided that's what they want to do is. And I think as this field becomes more mature, there will be a similar approach in cultivating meat, in alternative proteins, in precision fermentation, of these tools being bundled together, particularly by smaller companies who don't have the capacity to produce the products in scale, but maybe want to partner with someone with that production capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're seeing a lot at the moment in the industry. I mean, in the long run, you probably wouldn't agree with this either. Could strong IP rights for alternative proteins inadvertently create monopolies?
Yeah, I mean, strong IP rights. I mean, inadvertent. I mean, they overtly do create a monopoly, right? They are a limited monopoly right. That is what, that's what patent says and what the trademark does. But I think in terms of what people really mean when they talk about monopolies being created by IPs, they mean sort of concerning monopolies, and those are things that I believe, and particularly in this sector, are going to be driven as much by cost of starting up, capital expenditure required to build sites, to build reactors, as it is to having the legal right to stop other people from doing whatever your patent says. I think I don't think they create the monopoly. They may be that they can be used as a tool to support existing ones, but also they can be used as tools to limit other people starting monopolies. If you have the patent for some useful technology, someone with more capital expenditure can't merely go ahead and do what you were doing. So it does, yeah. But unsurprising response, as you say. But I obviously don't think that IP rights are going to be a massive source of concern.
I mean, there's a collaborative spirit in this sector, at least seemingly there is. We don't hear too much about cases ongoing. There are a few, of course, but I mean, could you consider a specific... Well, let's wait and see once these products become more widely available and the competition becomes more important. But could you consider a specific case study involving a company and the IP issues it's faced?
Yeah, no, of course. So, I mean, the previous role I was involved in some contentious action with Upside Foods at European Patent Office. So, is already starting very early on. But that field is not at a level of maturity where there are big litigations, big disputes. And sort of an obvious one to look at is probably the impossible motif dispute over leg hemoglobin that's sort of still trundling on. This concerned the genetically modified yeasts that produced soy hemoglobin, so normally found in the roots of soybeans, and they produce they basically took the genes for those, put them in, or rather Impossible did, put them in yeast, produced it in a big quantity, and what that does is with other additives in the food, it produces that meaty flavour. If anyone's eaten an Impossible burger in the US, they've noticed that. I mean, this is quite old news. Like it's still ongoing. In the US, there was some, Motif, who sort of spin out Ginkgo Bioworks, was sort of accused of infringing and have led sort of a attempt at reviewing the patent, basically saying it's invalid in the US, but unsuccessful. In Europe, they did a similar thing and were, in first instance, successful at getting the patent revoked for a lack of sufficiency in that case. So they basically said that to the extent the claims were basically quite broad, and to the extent that someone would have to identify the right hemes to use and the right other compounds to add, like that was an undue burden. It was a fishing expedition. The point was they didn't tell you how to do it. They just gave you a problem to solve, and that's not allowed in patents. And then to the extent that there were specific combinations, the European Patent Office felt that it was obvious to combine them because they were sort of enough was known about them that you'd at least give it a go. But there's an appeal ongoing on that, so that's going to continue for the next few years. And in the US, I believe there's still an appeal ongoing. I mean, the point of this, I think, though, is that it sort of shows it shows a couple of interesting things about the space. So it shows that like there is this territoriality, like there's different results in the US and Europe because the patents were different, and that's partly because of different business concerns. In Europe, GM approaches were not used in Impossible's products that were available in Europe. So and they had a different approach to patenting. The claims were different, so they sort of tailored their approach to different countries and ended up with different results. So that's sort of going back to that idea of having lots of overlapping rights to cover because they'll have different strengths in different places. You sort of need that portfolio covering your key assets. But I think sort of more interestingly, it shows that this is serious business. So Motif was spun out of Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a very big biotechnology company. Impossible, I think, they were a multi-billion-dollar valued company at the time. They're both very large concerns, and they were willing to go through this sort of quite costly, quite extensive legal procedures to have patents cleared out the way. And the kind of litigation and contentious disputes, they're not very normal in food technology. Normally in food tech, it's IP disputes are fairly low value. Those that do occur tend to revolve around branding, so around trademarks. So there's quite a lot of high-profile disputes in that area. But they're more in hardware, so things like coffee pods and machines or ice cream makers that are quite litigious areas because they're bits of heavy engineering, essentially. But for sort of foods as such, things often settle before courts and before these kind of actions because the value of individual products can be quite low. So I think this sort of shows that the alt protein market, and this is plant-based, remember, so this is sort of the lower technology, although this is quite a high-tech plant-based, it's lower technology compared to cell-based approaches, which are going to be a lot of very difficult biology needs to go into. It shows that the market and therefore the legal space, it's much more like biotech, it's much more like pharma than traditional food, which companies have to be aware of and have to build their strategy around that. And their investment strategy is going to have to be litigation ready, not just investment ready, because that is something that's going to come down the line. I think we're going to see more of these disputes as time goes on. There have been, I'm a European and UK attorney, so that's mainly where my practice focuses. But we do see anonymous observations on applications in this field at the patent office, which is usually a sign that there is another interested party that is hoping to persuade the patent office that someone shouldn't get a patent on this technology because it's old, it's obvious, because they're interested and because it matters to their business. I think that's only going to increase as the sort of biotech risk reward matrix means that there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of rewards. It's worth taking those taking those actions. So I think it's a sign of things to come. I'll be interested to see how it resolves finally, but I don't think this is the last we've seen of high-profile disputes and contentious matters in alternative proteins by a long way.
Now, I've got, obviously, you work in the legal field, but you're also in novel foods, food tech. Are there any stories in particular over the past 6-12 months in the food tech area that have excited you, that you've sort of caught your attention?
I don't know. Have you seen anything, Andrew?
I'm always excited by new regulatory approvals. There's a whole skein of just because I've been working in sort of alternative proteins since about probably about 20 for the last sort of 5 years or so, and I've not tasted them yet. I'm really excited to when I saw that every ALF Farms filed their first request for regulatory approval for a cell-based meat in the UK. I was really excited when I saw Meatable had applied for one in the Netherlands. I started looking at flights to Amsterdam and thinking, I can probably make that.
I'll come with you.
I'm excited. to give it a try, because I've been reading about it, learning about it, getting excited about it, boring my friends and loved ones about it for quite a while now. For me, that'll be something quite special, having that moment.
Yeah. I remember being at school, probably like mid-90s, wanting to be vegetarian but liking meat too much, thinking, I wish we could grow meat in jars. This was like ages ago, and it just went out of my head. And now, like, why did I not pursue it? It could have been me doing it now. But I'm ready to give it a try when we can.
Yeah, definitely. Look, Andrew, Sarah, thank you very much for your time today. It's been fascinating talking to you. It's not a subject we focus on a lot in this magazine, but it's certainly a subject that's very, very important to our readers, all of those startups and companies that are slightly bigger as well, I would imagine. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's been really fun.